Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I decided to hike the Appalachian Trail alone, hoping to find some peace and clear my mind. The trail had always been on my bucket list, and I finally had the time. I packed my gear, left a detailed itinerary with a friend, and set off early one morning. The first few days were uneventful, filled with the simple pleasure of being in nature. On the fourth day, the weather turned. Dark clouds gathered, and a heavy rain began to fall. I pushed through, determined to reach the next shelter. As I was walking, I heard voices up ahead. At first, I thought it was other hikers, but as I got closer, I realized the voices were harsh and angry. I slowed down, my curiosity piqued. The voices were coming from a small clearing off the trail. I crept closer, staying behind the cover of the trees. Peering through the branches, I saw a group of men. They were heavily armed and seemed to be arguing. My heart pounded as I realized they weren't hikers. One of the men saw me before I could back away. He shouted, and in an instant, they all turned toward me. I tried to run, but they were too fast. Two of them tackled me to the ground, their grip rough and unforgiving. They dragged me into the clearing, and I could see the fear in their eyes. "Who are you?" one of them demanded, shoving me against a tree. I stammered out my name, trying to explain that I was just a hiker, but they didn't believe me. They searched my backpack, pulling out my map and my phone. One of them, who seemed to be the leader, examined my ID and then looked at me with suspicion. "He's just a hiker," he said, but his tone was unsure. "But he knows we're here now." I tried to explain that I wouldn't tell anyone, that I would just keep hiking, but they didn't trust me. They tied my hands behind my back and forced me to sit down. The leader, a man with a scar running down his cheek, began to discuss what to do with me. The others wanted to get rid of me, but he seemed hesitant. Hours passed. I sat there, cold and wet, listening to their arguments. They talked about a robbery gone wrong and how they were hiding out until things cooled down. They were clearly desperate and scared, which made them even more dangerous. As night fell, they set up a small campfire. The leader finally decided they would keep me until they could figure out a safe way to let me go. They took shifts watching me, their guns always within reach. I barely slept, my mind racing with thoughts of escape. Early the next morning, they decided to move. They untied my feet but kept my hands bound. We walked for hours, deeper into the forest. My legs ached, and I stumbled several times, but they kept pushing me forward. I tried to memorize the path, hoping for a chance to escape. That chance came when one of the men, who was watching me closely, slipped on a wet rock and fell, twisting his ankle. The others were distracted, helping him up. I saw my opportunity and took it, running as fast as I could. My hands were still tied, making it difficult to keep my balance, but adrenaline fueled me. I heard them shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. Finally, I found a small cave and hid inside, trying to catch my breath. I could hear them searching for me, their voices growing fainter. I waited until I was sure they were gone, then cautiously emerged. I managed to find a sharp rock and used it to cut the ropes around my wrists. My hands were numb, but the relief was immense. I knew I had to keep moving, so I found my bearings and headed in the opposite direction of where they had gone. For hours, I trekked through the forest, fear driving me forward. I had no idea if they were still looking for me or if they had given up, but I couldn't take any chances. By nightfall, I found a small stream and followed it, hoping it would lead me to safety. The next day, I finally stumbled upon a ranger station. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and covered in cuts and bruises. The rangers were shocked to see me and immediately called for help. I told them everything, and they assured me I was safe now. They took me to a nearby town, where I gave a full report to the police. The men were eventually caught, their hideout discovered thanks to my information. It took me a long time to recover from the ordeal, both physically and mentally. I had planned a solo camping trip in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. I wanted some time away from the city, from work, and just about everything else. The first couple of days were perfect. The forest was peaceful, the air was fresh, and I felt completely at ease. On the third day, I decided to explore deeper into the woods. I was enjoying the solitude and the sounds of nature. As I was hiking, I stumbled upon a small clearing. There, I saw a man in hunting gear, crouched down and fiddling with something on the ground. He looked up when he heard me approach. Our eyes met, and he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I nodded and tried to move on, but he called out to me. "Hey, you shouldn't be here. This is a restricted area." I apologized, said I didn't know, and turned to leave. But his next words stopped me cold. "Wait, what did you see?" "Nothing," I replied quickly. "I just walked in. I didn't see anything." He stared at me, his eyes hard and calculating. It made me uneasy, and I started to back away. He stood up, still watching me, and I decided to walk faster. As I made my way back to my campsite, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I didn't see anyone. When I got back, I packed up my gear, deciding it was time to leave. Something about that man just didn't sit right with me. I started hiking back towards my car, which was parked a few miles away. The sun was beginning to set, and the forest was growing darker. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear footsteps behind me, getting closer. I turned around and saw him. The hunter was following me, his face set in a grim expression. I broke into a run, the underbrush scratching at my legs and arms as I tore through the forest. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from him. I could hear him crashing through the forest behind me, getting closer. My lungs burned, and I stumbled over a root, falling hard to the ground. I scrambled up, but he was right there. He grabbed my arm, yanking me back. "You saw too much," he hissed. I fought back, kicking and scratching. I managed to break free and took off again, adrenaline giving me a burst of energy. I knew I had to hide, so I veered off the trail and found a thick cluster of bushes. I dove into them, trying to make myself as small as possible. I held my breath, listening as he ran past me. I stayed hidden for what felt like hours, too scared to move. When I finally dared to peek out, it was dark, and the forest was silent. I knew I couldn't stay there all night, so I crept out and started making my way towards where I thought the road was. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves had me on edge. I was terrified he would find me again. I moved as quietly as I could, trying to stay off the main path. The darkness made it hard to see, and I stumbled often, but I kept going. Finally, I saw the faint glow of headlights through the trees. I hurried towards them, desperate for help. As I broke through the tree line, I saw a car parked on the side of the road. I waved my arms, shouting for help. The driver got out, a middle-aged woman who looked shocked to see me. I told her someone was after me, and she ushered me into her car. She drove me to the nearest town, and I called the police from there. The authorities searched the forest but didn't find the hunter. They did find signs of illegal hunting activity in the area, but the man was long gone. I gave them a description, but I never heard anything more about it. That experience left me shaken. I still love the outdoors, but I'm much more cautious now. I always let someone know where I'm going and when I'll be back. I had been looking forward to my fishing trip in the Alaskan wilderness for months. I needed a break from my hectic life, and there was something about the isolation and the challenge that appealed to me. I packed my gear, loaded up my truck, and drove out to a remote spot I had found on a map. It was miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest and icy rivers. The first few days were perfect. The air was crisp, the scenery was stunning, and I had the river all to myself. I spent my days fishing and my nights by the campfire, listening to the sounds of the wilderness. I felt completely at peace. On the fourth day, I was fishing along a particularly quiet stretch of the river when I had the strange feeling that I was being watched. I looked around but saw nothing unusual. Just trees and the river flowing by. I shrugged it off and kept fishing, but the feeling stayed with me. Later that evening, as I was cooking my dinner over the fire, I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing, but then I caught a glimpse of movement. Someone was out there. I called out, thinking maybe it was a lost hiker, but there was no answer. The rustling stopped, and everything went quiet again. I tried to shake off the unease and went to bed, but I had trouble sleeping. Every little noise seemed amplified, and I kept imagining someone lurking just beyond the light of my campfire. In the morning, I found fresh footprints around my campsite. They weren't mine. Someone had been here during the night, watching me. I decided to move my camp further up the river, hoping to get away from whoever was out there. I packed up my gear and hiked for a couple of hours until I found a new spot that seemed more secluded. I set up camp again and tried to put the previous night out of my mind. But the feeling of being watched returned. As I fished, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there. That evening, I heard the rustling again, closer this time. I shone my flashlight into the trees and saw a figure dart behind a tree. It was a man, dirty and unkempt, with wild eyes. He looked like he had been living out here for a long time. I called out to him, asking if he needed help, but he just stared at me from behind the tree, not saying a word. I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about his gaze was unnerving. I backed away slowly, keeping my flashlight on him, and went back to my camp. I didn't sleep at all that night, keeping my fire burning bright and my knife close at hand. In the morning, the man was gone, but his footprints were all around my camp. I decided it was time to leave. I packed up my gear and started hiking back towards my truck. The whole way, I felt like I was being followed. I kept hearing twigs snapping and leaves rustling, but every time I turned around, I saw nothing. As I neared the spot where I had parked my truck, I saw the man again, standing in the middle of the path. He was holding a crude spear and had a crazed look in his eyes. I stopped, my heart pounding. He took a step towards me, raising the spear. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the cuts and scrapes I was getting from the branches. I could hear him chasing after me, his footsteps getting closer. I stumbled and fell, rolling down a small hill. I landed hard, the wind knocked out of me, but I scrambled to my feet and kept running. I finally burst out onto the dirt road where my truck was parked. I jumped in, locking the doors behind me. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking, and started the engine. As I sped away, I saw the man emerge from the trees, watching me with those wild eyes. I drove for hours until I reached the nearest town. I reported the encounter to the local authorities, but they didn't seem too concerned. They said there were a few hermits living out in the wilderness, but they usually kept to themselves. I didn't care. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. That trip changed me. I used to love the idea of solitude and the wilderness, but now I can't shake the memory of those eyes watching me from the darkness. I had been exploring the vast woods of Maine for a few days. The silence and beauty of nature were all I needed to clear my head. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape from my stressful job. I had a small cabin rented for the week, far from any town or other people. One afternoon, while hiking deeper into the forest, I heard a faint cry. It sounded like a child. My heart started pounding as I rushed toward the sound. After a few minutes, I found a small boy lying on the ground, clutching his leg. He looked about 8 years old, with dirt-smeared cheeks and tears in his eyes. I knelt beside him and asked if he was okay. He said he had fallen and hurt his leg. I offered to carry him back to my cabin, but he insisted he needed to get back to his family. Against my better judgment, I agreed to follow him. He led me deeper into the woods, further from any paths I recognized. After what felt like an hour, we arrived at a rundown shack hidden among the trees. I had a bad feeling, but the boy seemed desperate. As we approached, the door creaked open and a man stepped out. He was tall and unkempt, with a wild look in his eyes. Behind him, 2 more men emerged, equally rough-looking. "Who are you?" the first man demanded. I explained what had happened, hoping they were just a strange, reclusive family. The man's expression softened slightly as he looked at the boy. "That's my nephew," he said, but there was something off in his tone. Before I could react, one of the other men grabbed my arm. "You're coming inside," he said gruffly. Panic surged through me as they pulled me into the shack. The interior was dark and smelled of mildew. There were makeshift beds and empty cans scattered around. It looked like they had been living there for a while. The man who seemed to be in charge shoved me into a corner and demanded to know if I had told anyone I was coming here. I lied and said no one knew. He eyed me suspiciously but seemed to believe me for the moment. The boy sat quietly on one of the beds, avoiding my gaze. I realized he must have been coerced into luring me here. The men started talking among themselves in hushed tones, occasionally glancing my way. I caught bits and pieces about being on the run and needing to move again. I knew I had to escape, but they were watching me closely. The windows were boarded up, and the door was the only exit. I needed to find a way to distract them. My chance came when one of the men left to fetch water, and the others seemed to relax a bit. I told them I needed to use the bathroom, hoping they had one inside. The leader pointed to a small, filthy room at the back. I went in and locked the door, my mind racing. There was a small window, but it was too high and narrow to climb through. I noticed a rusty old mirror hanging on the wall and an idea struck me. I smashed the mirror, breaking off a shard to use as a weapon. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and walked back into the main room. The men were startled by the noise, and I saw the leader's eyes widen when he saw the shard in my hand. "Stay back," I warned, my voice shaking. The leader laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. I took a step forward, brandishing the shard. The other man moved to grab me, but I slashed at him, catching his arm. He yelped in pain and stumbled back. In the commotion, the boy ran to my side. "This way," he whispered, pulling me toward the back of the shack. We slipped out through a narrow door that led to a small clearing. I could hear the men shouting behind us. We ran through the woods, branches scratching at our skin. The boy seemed to know where he was going, and I followed him blindly. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could hear the men crashing through the forest behind us. Eventually, we reached a small river. The boy led me to a hidden path that ran alongside it. We followed the path until we came to an old, abandoned cabin. We hid inside, trying to catch our breath. The boy explained that he and his mother had been taken by the men a few months ago. His mother had tried to escape and was killed. He had been too scared to run until now. We stayed hidden until nightfall, then made our way back to my cabin. I called the police and reported everything. They arrived quickly, and a search party was sent out. The men were eventually caught, and the boy was taken into protective custody. The experience left me shaken. The woods, which had once felt so peaceful, now seemed filled with hidden dangers. I cut my trip short and returned home. I had been feeling overwhelmed with work and thought some time in nature would do me good. I packed my gear and drove up to a remote spot I had read about. It was supposed to be secluded, perfect for some quiet time alone. The first night was peaceful. I set up my tent, made a fire, and enjoyed the sounds of the wilderness. The next day, I went for a hike, exploring the trails and taking in the beauty of the mountains. The air was crisp, and the scenery was breathtaking. It was exactly what I needed. On the second day, I decided to venture further from my campsite. I followed a narrow trail that seemed less traveled. After walking for about an hour, I noticed a strange smell. It was chemical and sharp, not like anything I had encountered in nature before. Curious, I decided to follow the scent, thinking it might lead to an interesting discovery. The smell grew stronger as I walked, and I soon stumbled upon a small, hidden clearing. In the middle of it, there was a rundown cabin with several barrels and containers scattered around. It didn't take long for me to realize I had found a meth lab. My heart started racing as I understood the danger I was in. I knew I had to leave immediately, but as I turned to go, I heard voices approaching. I quickly hid behind a large tree, trying to stay out of sight. A group of 3 men appeared, all of them rough-looking and armed. They were talking loudly, clearly agitated. I couldn't make out everything they were saying, but I caught enough to know they were paranoid about being discovered. My mind raced as I tried to figure out how to get back to my campsite without being seen. I waited until the men went inside the cabin, then slowly started to creep away. I thought I was in the clear, but suddenly, I stepped on a twig, and it snapped loudly. The sound echoed through the clearing. One of the men shouted, and I heard them running towards me. Panic surged through me, and I took off, running as fast as I could. I could hear them behind me, yelling and cursing. The forest was thick, and I had to dodge branches and jump over rocks, but I didn't dare slow down. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like they were on fire, but I couldn't stop. I knew if they caught me, it would be the end. I stumbled and fell a few times, scraping my hands and knees, but I kept going. The sounds of their pursuit grew fainter, but I didn't dare stop. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a stream. I remembered crossing it earlier and knew my campsite wasn't far. I waded through the water, hoping to throw off my scent. On the other side, I found a thick patch of bushes and crawled into it, trying to catch my breath and listen for any signs of the men. I stayed hidden for what felt like hours, too scared to move. Eventually, the forest grew quiet again. I carefully made my way back to my campsite, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I finally saw my tent, I almost cried with relief. I knew I couldn't stay there. I quickly packed up my gear, trying to be as quiet as possible. As soon as I was ready, I headed back to my car. The hike back was nerve-wracking, every rustle and sound making me jump. When I finally reached the parking area and saw my car, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I drove straight to the nearest town and found the police station. I told them everything about the meth lab and the men who chased me. They took my report seriously and said they would investigate. I didn't stick around to find out what happened. I just wanted to get as far away from those mountains as possible. The experience left me shaken. What was supposed to be a peaceful retreat turned into a nightmare. I don't think I'll ever go camping alone again. I was deep in the Amazon, taking photos of wildlife. It was my passion, capturing the raw beauty of nature. I had been planning this trip for months, saved up every penny. Finally, I was here, surrounded by the dense jungle, the sounds of birds and insects all around. On the third day, I decided to venture further from my camp. The early morning light was perfect, and I wanted to get some shots of the rare birds I had read about. The air was thick with humidity, and every step I took made the undergrowth crunch beneath my boots. I was focused on a colorful toucan when I heard a distant noise, something unnatural in the symphony of the jungle. It sounded like voices. Curious, I crept closer, making sure to stay hidden. As I got nearer, the voices became clearer. They were speaking in a language I didn't understand, but the tone was harsh and aggressive. Peering through the thick foliage, I saw a group of men. They had guns and were gathered around something large and covered. My heart sank when I realized what it was, a poaching operation. They had killed a jaguar and were in the process of skinning it. The sight made my stomach churn. I knew I had to get out of there and report this. Slowly, I started to back away, but I wasn't careful enough. My foot snapped a twig. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence. The men immediately stopped what they were doing and looked around, shouting to each other. Panic surged through me. I turned and ran, crashing through the jungle, not caring about the noise anymore. Behind me, I could hear them yelling and giving chase. My camera equipment banged against my side, but I didn't stop to secure it. The jungle seemed to close in around me, branches whipping my face and roots trying to trip me. I was breathing hard, my heart pounding in my ears. The men were getting closer. I could hear their footsteps, their angry voices. I came to a small river and without thinking, plunged in. The water was cold and deep, but it provided a momentary barrier between me and my pursuers. I swam as fast as I could to the other side and scrambled up the bank, my clothes heavy and clinging to me. For a brief moment, I lost sight of them. I used that time to hide behind a large tree, trying to catch my breath and think. I knew I couldn't stay still for long. They would find me if I did. I needed a plan. Looking around, I saw a narrow animal trail leading further into the jungle. It was risky, but I had no other choice. I took off again, this time trying to be quieter. Every step was calculated, every breath controlled. The trail twisted and turned, and I prayed it would lead me to safety. The sounds of the men faded, but I knew they were still looking for me. I had to keep moving. The sun was starting to set, and the jungle was becoming darker and more foreboding. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I stumbled upon a small clearing. In the center was a tree with low branches. I climbed up, hoping to get a better view and perhaps spot my camp. From my perch, I could see a faint trail of smoke in the distance. It was my campfire. Climbing down carefully, I headed in that direction, every sense on high alert. It felt like hours before I finally saw the familiar side of my tent. I collapsed inside, shaking with relief. but I knew I wasn't safe yet. I gathered my things quickly, packing only the essentials. I needed to get out of the jungle and find help. Using my compass and map, I plotted the quickest route back to the nearest village. It would be a tough hike, but it was my only option. As I set off, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustle, every shadow made my heart race. The jungle, once a place of wonder, had become a terrifying maze. I forced myself to keep going, one step at a time. The journey back was grueling. My legs ached, and my mind played tricks on me, but I kept moving. I couldn't let those poachers find me. Finally, after what felt like days, I saw the edge of the jungle and the outline of a small village. I stumbled into the village, exhausted and terrified. The locals were kind, giving me water and listening to my story. They contacted the authorities, and I knew I had done the right thing. But the fear and adrenaline wouldn't leave me. Even now, safe and back home, the memories haunt me. I had always loved camping, especially in remote places where you could really feel away from it all. This time, my friends and I decided to camp in a secluded area of the Adirondacks. We wanted a real adventure, away from the usual spots crowded with tourists. We set up our tents near a quiet lake surrounded by dense woods. The first couple of days were perfect, just us and nature. We hiked, fished, and enjoyed the peace. On the third night, we decided to split up to gather firewood before it got too dark. I wandered off, figuring I knew the area well enough. As I walked deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around me. I lost sight of the camp, but I wasn't worried. I had my flashlight and plenty of time to get back. After gathering a decent pile of wood, I realized it was getting darker faster than I expected. I turned to head back, but the forest seemed different. I tried retracing my steps, but nothing looked familiar. I kept walking, hoping to find a landmark, but it was like the woods were shifting around me. Panic started to set in. I yelled for my friends, but my voice seemed to vanish into the trees. After what felt like hours, I saw a small cabin through the trees. Relief washed over me. Maybe someone there could help. I approached the cabin, noticing it looked old and run down. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I tried the door, and it creaked open. Inside, it was dark and smelled musty. I called out, but still no response. I was about to leave when I heard a noise behind me. I turned and saw a man standing in the doorway. He was tall, with a wild look in his eyes. He didn't say anything, just stared at me. "I'm lost," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you help me get back to my camp?" He didn't answer, just stepped closer. There was something off about him. His clothes were dirty, and he had a hunting knife strapped to his belt. I took a step back, my heart pounding. "I didn't mean to intrude," I said, inching toward the door. "I'll just go." Before I could move, he lunged at me. I ducked and ran out the door, dropping the firewood. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the underbrush. I didn't know where I was going, just that I had to get away. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. The woods were dark now, and every shadow seemed to hide him. I found a large tree and crouched behind it, trying to catch my breath. I listened for any sign of him, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat. After a while, I started moving again, slowly and quietly. I needed to find my way back to camp. I thought about my friends and hoped they were okay. The fear of that man kept me moving. I stumbled onto a narrow path and decided to follow it, hoping it would lead somewhere safe. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, terrified he would appear out of the darkness. The path twisted and turned, and I felt like I was going in circles. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I heard voices. Familiar voices. I followed the sound and burst into a small clearing. There were my friends, gathered around a fire, looking worried. They jumped up when they saw me, bombarding me with questions. I tried to explain what happened, but I was too shaken to make much sense. All I knew was we had to leave, now. We quickly packed up our camp, not wanting to risk another encounter with the man. As we hiked out, I kept looking back, half expecting to see him watching us. The feeling of being hunted stayed with me long after we were safe. Back home, the experience haunted me. I couldn't shake the image of his wild eyes and the feeling of being trapped in those woods. Camping, something I once loved, now filled me with dread. I still think about that night and wonder who he was and what would have happened if I hadn't escaped. I'm grateful I got out, but the fear lingers, a reminder that sometimes the real danger is just a heartbeat away, hidden in the quiet places we least expect. Last summer, I decided to take a solo trip to the forests of northern Sweden. I'd always loved the solitude and the beauty of nature there. I planned to camp for a week, far from any towns or other people. The first few days were perfect. The weather was clear, and the forest was peaceful. I spent my time hiking, fishing, and enjoying the quiet. On the fourth day, I decided to explore deeper into the forest. I'd seen some interesting terrain on my map and wanted to check it out. After a few hours of hiking, I came across an area that looked different from the rest of the forest. The trees were thicker, and there was an old, overgrown path leading further in. Curiosity got the better of me, and I followed the path. After about half an hour, I found something strange. Hidden among the trees was what looked like an old bunker. The entrance was covered in moss, and it looked like it hadn't been used in years. I hesitated, but then I decided to take a closer look. The door was slightly ajar, so I pushed it open and stepped inside. It was dark and smelled musty. I used my flashlight to see. The bunker was bigger than I expected. There were several rooms, all filled with crates and boxes. I started to look around and quickly realized that this place was some sort of stash. The crates were filled with all sorts of stolen goods, electronics, jewelry, and even some cash. It felt like I had stumbled into something I shouldn't have. I was about to leave when I heard voices outside. Panic set in. I turned off my flashlight and hid behind a stack of crates. The voices got closer, and soon I heard footsteps entering the bunker. There were at least 3 men, talking in hushed tones. They sounded angry, like they were arguing about something. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. One of them had a flashlight and was scanning the room. They were talking about a deal that had gone wrong and how they needed to move the goods soon. I was terrified they would find me. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. The men moved further into the bunker, and I saw my chance to escape. I quietly made my way back to the entrance, praying they wouldn't notice me. Just as I reached the door, I tripped over something and fell, making a loud noise. The men shouted, and I knew I had been discovered. I bolted out of the bunker and into the forest, not looking back. I could hear them chasing me, yelling threats. I ran as fast as I could, weaving through the trees, trying to lose them. My lungs were burning, but I couldn't stop. I had to get away. The forest was dense, and it was getting harder to see as the sun started to set. I stumbled over roots and branches, trying to put as much distance between me and the men as possible. I could still hear them behind me, but they were getting farther away. I didn't dare slow down. After what felt like hours, I found a small cave and crawled inside. I was exhausted and scared, but I knew I couldn't stay there for long. I listened for any sounds of the men but heard nothing. I decided to wait until it was completely dark before moving again. When night fell, I cautiously left the cave and started making my way back to my campsite. I took a different route, hoping to avoid running into the men again. It was slow going in the dark, but I finally reached my tent just before dawn. I quickly packed up my things, not wanting to stay there any longer. As soon as I was ready, I started the hike back to civilization. Every sound in the forest made me jump, but I didn't see any sign of the men. It took me most of the day to reach the nearest town. I went straight to the police and told them everything. They took my report seriously and said they would investigate. I was shaken by the whole experience. I had never felt so scared in my life. The thought of what could have happened if they had caught me still haunts me. I haven't been able to go camping since then. The forest, which once felt like a refuge, now feels like a place of danger. I'm grateful I made it out safely, but the fear and anxiety linger. It's a reminder that sometimes, even in the most peaceful places, danger can be just around the corner. I decided to take a solo backpacking trip in the Black Forest in Germany. It was a place I'd always wanted to visit. I started my hike early in the morning, excited about the adventure ahead. The forest was beautiful, dense with trees and full of the sounds of nature. I felt free and alive, enjoying every step of the way. Around midday, I stopped for a break near a small stream. While I was eating, I noticed a man on the trail. He looked like he was also hiking, carrying a backpack and dressed in outdoor gear. At first, I thought nothing of it. People hike all the time, right? But as I resumed my hike, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was following me. I kept moving, trying to stay ahead. Every time I looked back, he was there, keeping pace with me. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was a coincidence. But the unease grew as the hours passed. By late afternoon, I was sure he was following me on purpose. My heart started racing, and I quickened my pace. As the sun began to set, I decided to set up camp. I found a small clearing, hoping he would just pass by and leave me alone. But as I was pitching my tent, he appeared at the edge of the clearing. He didn't say anything, just stood there watching me. I forced myself to stay calm, finishing my tent and pretending not to notice him. He finally approached, a smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. He asked if he could share my campsite since it was getting dark. I didn't want to seem rude or scared, so I agreed, but my gut told me this was a mistake. He set up his tent a little too close to mine for comfort. We sat by the fire, making small talk. He said his name was Klaus and that he was also backpacking solo. But something about his story didn't add up. His eyes never seemed to leave me, and his smile was unsettling. The tension in the air was thick. I barely touched my dinner, too nervous to eat. When it was time to sleep, I crawled into my tent, every instinct telling me to stay awake. I heard him moving around outside, the sound of footsteps circling my tent. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath, hoping he would just go to sleep. But the sounds didn't stop. Instead, they got closer. Suddenly, my tent zipper started to open. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the only thing I had for protection, a small camping knife. I didn't want to use it, but I was terrified. Klaus's face appeared in the opening, his expression twisted with something like anger or frustration. He said he wanted to talk, but his tone was menacing. I yelled at him to get away, holding the knife out in front of me. He laughed, a cold, hollow sound, and told me I was overreacting. But I could see the shift in his eyes, the way his smile faded. He wasn't going to leave me alone. My hands were shaking, but I knew I had to do something. I lunged at him with the knife, hoping to scare him off. He jumped back, surprised, but then his face twisted with rage. He grabbed my wrist, trying to wrestle the knife away from me. I struggled, kicking and thrashing, desperate to get him away. In the chaos, I managed to cut his arm. He yelled in pain, loosening his grip. I took my chance and bolted out of the tent, running into the dark forest. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get away. The trees seemed to close in around me, branches scratching my face and arms. I could hear him crashing through the underbrush behind me, cursing and shouting. I ran until my lungs burned, and I couldn't hear him anymore. I found a thick cluster of bushes and crawled inside, trying to catch my breath. I stayed hidden, listening for any sign of him. Hours seemed to pass, the forest eerily silent. I was too scared to move, too scared to sleep. Eventually, the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. I cautiously emerged from my hiding place, my body aching and exhausted. I knew I had to find help, get back to civilization. I retraced my steps as best as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. It took most of the day, but I finally found my way back to a main trail. I flagged down the first hikers I saw, a group of friends who were startled by my appearance. They helped me to the nearest town, where I told the authorities everything. They took my report and assured me they would look for Klaus. I was shaken, but relieved to be safe. I was traveling through the remote woods of Siberia, a place I'd always wanted to see. The untouched wilderness had a sort of haunting beauty to it, and the isolation was a strange mix of peaceful and unnerving. My trip was supposed to be an adventure, something to break the monotony of everyday life. I was alone, which added to the thrill. The weather was cold, as expected. Snow blanketed the ground, and the trees stood tall and silent. It was easy to get lost in thought while walking through those woods, and that's probably why I didn't notice them at first. When I did, it was too late. I stumbled upon a clearing, and there they were, 3 men, rough-looking, dirty, and clearly not supposed to be there. I froze, realizing my mistake. They saw me immediately. One of them shouted something in Russian, and before I could react, they were on me. They grabbed me, their hands rough and unforgiving. I struggled, but it was no use. They were too strong. They dragged me to their camp, a makeshift setup hidden deep in the forest. There was a fire burning, and around it were more men, all looking as rough as the ones who had captured me. I recognized the look in their eyes, desperation and danger. I had heard stories about escaped convicts in Siberia, but I never thought I would encounter them. Now, I was their prisoner. They tied my hands and pushed me to the ground near the fire. One of them, who seemed to be the leader, started talking to me in broken English. He demanded to know who I was and what I was doing there. I tried to explain that I was just a traveler, but he didn't seem to care. He laughed, a harsh, cruel sound, and said something to the others. They all laughed too. I realized then that my survival depended on keeping calm and finding a way out. I watched them carefully, noting how they interacted and who seemed to be in charge. The leader was the one to focus on. He was the key to my escape. They kept me tied up, giving me just enough food and water to keep me alive. Days passed in a blur of fear and planning. I pretended to be more helpless than I was, hoping they would underestimate me. They mostly ignored me, which gave me time to observe. I noticed that the leader kept the key to my restraints on a cord around his neck. I would have to get that key. One night, after they had drunk themselves into a stupor, I saw my chance. The leader was passed out near the fire, the key just within reach. I quietly shuffled over to him, my heart pounding in my chest. I managed to grab the key without waking him and quickly freed myself. I knew I had to act fast. I took a knife from one of the sleeping men and slipped into the darkness of the forest. The cold air hit me like a wall, but I didn't stop. I ran as fast as I could, the snow crunching under my feet. The forest was disorienting in the dark, but I couldn't stop. I had to put as much distance between them and me as possible. I stumbled and fell several times, but I got back up, driven by the fear of what would happen if they caught me. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I saw lights in the distance. It was a small village, barely more than a few houses and a store. I made my way there, exhausted and freezing. I banged on the first door I came to, desperate for help. An old woman answered, her eyes widening in shock at the sight of me. I tried to explain what had happened, but I was so cold and tired that the words wouldn't come out right. She called for help, and soon I was surrounded by villagers. They took me in, giving me food and warmth. I learned later that the convicts had been caught not long after I escaped. The villagers had alerted the authorities, and they were captured without much resistance. The leader was the last to be found, hiding in a nearby cave. They told me I was lucky to be alive. I stayed in the village for a few days, recovering from my ordeal. The villagers were kind, and they helped me get back to civilization. I never thought I would be so grateful for simple things like a warm bed and a hot meal. The experience left me shaken, but it also made me appreciate life in a way I never had before. I learned the hard way how fragile our existence can be, and how quickly things can change. I had signed up for a spiritual retreat in the dense forests of Oregon, hoping to find some peace and clarity. The retreat promised a week of meditation, nature walks, and self-discovery, and I was eager to escape the noise of everyday life. The first few days were everything I had hoped for. The setting was beautiful, the air crisp and fresh, and the other participants seemed friendly enough. We were a small group, about 10 of us, and our guide, Martin, was this calm, soft-spoken man who seemed to have all the answers. He led us through meditation sessions, guided us on hikes, and spoke about finding inner peace. But as the days went on, I started noticing little things that felt off. The way Martin and some of the others exchanged glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when I walked by, and the way they seemed to be keeping secrets. One evening, Martin announced that we would have a special ceremony in a clearing deep in the forest. He said it was a tradition of the retreat, something to help us connect with nature and each other. We gathered around a fire as the sun set, the sky turning dark. Martin began chanting in a language I didn't recognize, and the others joined in. I felt a knot of unease in my stomach. As the chanting grew louder, Martin produced a small vial of liquid and handed it to each of us, saying it would help us see the truth. I hesitated, but everyone else drank it without question. I pretended to drink mine and kept the liquid in my mouth, spitting it out when no one was looking. Almost immediately, the others began to act strange. Their eyes glazed over, and they moved in unison, like they were in a trance. Martin started talking about shedding our old selves and being reborn. He looked at me, and for a moment, I thought he knew I hadn't drunk the liquid. But then he turned his attention to the others, leading them in a strange dance around the fire. My heart pounded in my chest. I needed to get out of there. I slipped away, moving quietly through the trees. The forest was dark and disorienting, and I stumbled over roots and rocks. Behind me, I could still hear the chanting, growing fainter as I put more distance between us. I had no idea where I was going, just that I needed to get away. After what felt like hours, I found myself at the edge of a small creek. I followed it, hoping it would lead me to safety. My mind raced with thoughts of what I had seen. This wasn't just a retreat. It was something much darker. I had to warn the others, get help, but first, I needed to find my way out. I walked through the night, the forest seeming to close in around me. Every sound made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced that Martin or one of the others would appear at any moment. Finally, as dawn broke, I saw a road through the trees. Relief washed over me, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. I followed the road until I came to a small town. Exhausted and dirty, I found a diner and stumbled inside. The waitress gave me a strange look but brought me a cup of coffee. I asked if there was a police station nearby, and she pointed me in the right direction. The officer on duty listened to my story with a skeptical expression but agreed to send someone to check it out. It took hours for them to find the clearing, and by then, it was empty. The fire was out, and there was no sign of Martin or the others. The officer looked at me like I was crazy, but I knew what I had seen. I knew they were out there, and that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. I left Oregon the next day, still shaken and unsure of what I had stumbled into. The experience haunted me, and I couldn't stop thinking about the others. What had happened to them? Were they still out there, or had they moved on to another unsuspecting group? I would never know for sure, but I was grateful to have escaped with my life. Since then, I've been more cautious about where I go and who I trust. The memory of that night in the forest is always with me, a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong. I don't know if I'll ever find the peace I was looking for, but I'm thankful just to be alive. I've been hunting in the deep woods of Montana for years, always alone. The silence of the forest and the thrill of the hunt give me peace. That morning, I left my cabin early, just as the sun was coming up. It was cold, my breath making little clouds in the air. I had my rifle slung over my shoulder and a pack with supplies. I was ready for a long day. By mid-morning, I was deep in the forest. I hadn't seen any game yet, but I wasn't worried. Sometimes, it took hours of patience. I found a good spot on a ridge overlooking a clearing and settled in. The woods were quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the call of birds. Around noon, I heard voices. That was strange because I'd never run into other hunters out here before. I stayed still, listening. The voices were getting closer, and they didn't sound friendly. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but there was an edge to their tone that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I decided to move, figuring it was better to avoid any potential trouble. I packed up quietly and started down the ridge, staying low. As I made my way through the trees, I caught a glimpse of them, a group of 5 men, heavily armed. They weren't dressed like hunters. They had military-style gear and serious-looking rifles. I ducked behind a tree, my heart pounding. I was trying to figure out what to do when I heard one of them shout. I peeked out and saw one of the men pointing in my direction. They'd seen me. Panic shot through me. I started moving faster, trying to put distance between us. I heard them crashing through the underbrush, coming after me. I ran for what felt like hours, my lungs burning and legs aching. The woods were dense, but I knew them well. I hoped that would give me an advantage. I could hear them yelling to each other, organizing a search pattern. They weren't going to give up easily. I found a small stream and waded into it, hoping to throw them off my trail. The cold water soaked my boots, but I kept going, following the stream until I found a place where it curved sharply. I climbed out and hid behind a cluster of rocks, catching my breath. I waited, listening. The voices faded a bit, and I dared to hope they'd lost me. But then, I heard a branch snap nearby. I froze. One of them was close. Too close. I held my rifle tightly, trying to stay calm. He appeared out of the trees, scanning the area. He had a hard look on his face, like he was ready to kill. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing. He moved past me, his eyes sweeping the ground for tracks. I waited until he was a few yards away, then slowly backed away, moving as quietly as possible. I kept moving, trying to stay downwind and out of sight. The afternoon was wearing on, and I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. I needed a plan. I decided to head for a spot I knew well, a small cave hidden in the rocks. It wasn't far, and it would give me some cover. It took me another hour to get there, moving carefully and listening for any sign of the men. When I finally reached the cave, I slipped inside and huddled in the darkness, exhausted. I could still hear them in the distance, but they seemed to be moving away. I hoped they thought I kept running. I stayed in the cave until nightfall, too scared to move. When it was completely dark, I crept out and started making my way back to my cabin. The forest was different at night, every sound magnified and every shadow a potential threat. I moved slowly, trying to stay as quiet as possible. It took me all night, but I finally made it back to my cabin just before dawn. I locked the door behind me and sank to the floor, shaking. I had never been so scared in my life. I didn't know who those men were or why they were out there, but I knew I had to get help. I radioed the nearest ranger station, telling them what had happened. They said they'd send someone out to check, but I could tell they didn't really believe me. It sounded crazy, like something out of a movie. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew I wasn't safe. I packed up my things and left Montana that same day, heading back to the city. I don't know if they ever found those men or if they even looked. I haven't been back to those woods since. I signed up for a survivalist weekend in the Canadian wilderness, thinking it would be a good way to disconnect from my stressful job. I was looking forward to learning new skills and spending time in nature. There were 10 of us in the group, led by an instructor named Steve. He was a rugged, middle-aged man with a no-nonsense attitude. He had a reputation for being tough, but I thought that was part of the experience. On the first day, we hiked deep into the forest. Steve showed us how to build shelters, start fires without matches, and find edible plants. He was knowledgeable, but there was something off about him. He had a cold, almost predatory look in his eyes that made me uneasy. I brushed it off as paranoia. Maybe he was just intense about his job. That night, we gathered around the campfire, sharing stories and getting to know each other. Steve was quiet, watching us with that same unsettling gaze. I noticed he kept his hunting knife close, even when he was just sitting by the fire. It made me nervous, but I didn't want to seem like a coward. The second day, Steve took us further into the wilderness. He seemed to get a thrill out of pushing us to our limits, making us hike longer and harder than necessary. A few people started complaining, but he shut them down quickly, saying we needed to toughen up. By the third day, things started to get really strange. Steve woke us up before dawn and told us we were going on a special exercise. He led us to a remote area, far from our base camp, and told us to split into pairs and find our way back using the skills he taught us. It sounded like a good challenge, but there was an edge to his voice that made me uneasy. I was paired with a guy named Mark. We followed the instructions, but after a few hours, it became clear that we were lost. The forest was dense, and we couldn't find any familiar landmarks. We decided to head back to the last place we'd seen Steve, hoping to regroup with the others. When we got back, we found something that made my blood run cold. One of the tents was slashed open, and there was blood on the ground. Mark and I stared at each other, panic rising. We knew something was very wrong. We decided to find the rest of the group and warn them. We moved quickly and quietly through the forest, trying to stay hidden. As we crept through the trees, we heard voices. We found Steve talking to another participant, a woman named Laura. He had his knife out, and he was saying something about needing to weed out the weak. Mark and I exchanged horrified looks. We needed to get everyone out of there, fast. We waited until Steve moved away, then approached Laura. She was shaken but unhurt. We told her what we'd seen and that we needed to warn the others. We split up, each of us heading in a different direction to find the rest of the group. I found 2 more participants, Hannah and Dave, and explained the situation. They were scared, but they agreed to come with me. We met up with Mark and Laura at the edge of the clearing. We had 6 people, including ourselves. That meant there were still 4 out there, possibly in danger. We needed to find them, but we also needed to be careful. Steve was clearly dangerous, and we couldn't risk confronting him directly. We moved quietly through the forest, keeping an eye out for Steve and the others. It took hours, but we finally found the rest of the group. They were confused and scared, but they believed us when we showed them the blood-stained tent. We decided to make a run for it. We didn't know if Steve had more weapons or if he was alone, but we couldn't take any chances. We moved as quickly and quietly as we could, trying to put as much distance between us and him as possible. The forest seemed to close in around us, every shadow and sound a potential threat. We kept moving, not stopping even when we were exhausted. We knew Steve would be looking for us, and we couldn't afford to be caught. As dawn broke, we finally reached a ranger station. We were battered and exhausted, but we were safe. We told the rangers what had happened, and they immediately launched a search for Steve. They found him later that day, hiding in the forest. He was arrested and taken away. It took a while for the reality of what had happened to sink in. We were lucky to be alive. I had always wanted to explore the jungles of Borneo. The dense, untouched wilderness fascinated me. I booked a guided tour with a local expert named Yanto, who came highly recommended. He knew the terrain well and promised an unforgettable experience. The first few days were everything I had hoped for. The jungle was alive with sounds, sights, and smells that were completely new to me. On the 4th day, we ventured deeper into the jungle, farther from any signs of civilization. We set up camp near a small river and decided to explore a bit before dark. Yanto went ahead to scout the area, telling me to wait by the camp. Minutes turned into an hour, and Yanto didn't return. I started to worry. The jungle was disorienting, and without Yanto, I felt completely lost. As dusk approached, I decided to search for him. I followed the path he had taken, but it wasn't long before I realized I was hopelessly lost. The dense foliage and the fading light made it difficult to find my way. Panic started to set in, but I kept moving, hoping to find a sign of Yanto or the camp. I stumbled through the undergrowth, pushing aside branches and vines. Suddenly, I heard voices. Relieved, I thought I had found Yanto and maybe some other travelers. I followed the sound, keeping low and moving quietly. The voices grew louder, and I soon saw a clearing up ahead. I crept closer, trying to stay hidden. What I saw made my blood run cold. A group of men, armed and rough-looking, were gathered around crates and bags. They were speaking in a language I didn't understand, but it was clear they were up to no good. My heart pounded as I realized I had stumbled into a smuggling ring's hideout. I tried to back away slowly, but I must have stepped on a twig or something, because one of the men looked up sharply. He shouted something, and in an instant, they all turned towards me. I turned to run, but they were faster. They grabbed me roughly, pulling me into the clearing. They tied my hands behind my back and pushed me to the ground. I tried to explain that I was just a lost tourist, but they didn't seem to care. They spoke among themselves, occasionally glancing at me with cold, calculating eyes. I felt a surge of fear like never before. These men were dangerous, and I was completely at their mercy. Night fell, and the jungle around us grew dark. The men lit a fire and continued their discussions, ignoring me for the most part. I strained to understand what they were saying, but it was no use. I could only wait and hope for a chance to escape. Hours passed. My mind raced with thoughts of what they might do to me. Would they kill me? Hold me for ransom? I didn't know, but I knew I had to stay alert and look for any opportunity to get away. At some point, the leader of the group came over to me. He was a tall man with a scar across his cheek. He spoke in broken English, asking who I was and what I was doing there. I told him everything, hoping he would believe me and let me go. He listened, then nodded slowly. For a moment, I thought he might release me, but instead, he told his men to keep me tied up. He said they would decide what to do with me in the morning. The night was long and cold. I couldn't sleep, partly because of the fear and partly because of the discomfort. The men kept watch, taking turns to ensure I didn't try anything. I was exhausted, but I knew I had to stay awake and alert. As dawn broke, the camp stirred to life. The men ate and prepared to move out. They tied a rope around my waist and led me through the jungle, deeper into the unknown. My mind raced with thoughts of escape, but with my hands tied and surrounded by armed men, there was little I could do. We marched for hours. The sun climbed higher, and the heat became oppressive. I stumbled several times, but they only yanked the rope harder, forcing me to keep up. I had to find a way out, but I needed to wait for the right moment. In the afternoon, we reached a larger camp. This one was more established, with tents and more supplies. There were more men here, and they looked just as dangerous as the first group. They shoved me into a small, makeshift cell made of wooden bars and locked the door. I was trapped, but at least I had a moment to gather my thoughts. I studied the camp, noting the layout and the guards' routines. I needed to find a weakness, a moment when I could slip away unnoticed. The hours dragged on, but I stayed focused. I had to be ready when the chance came. Night fell again, and the camp quieted down. Most of the men went to sleep, leaving only a couple of guards on duty. I noticed that one of the guards was particularly lax, often dozing off at his post. This was my chance. I waited until the guard was dozing, then I began to work on the ropes around my wrists. It was painful, but after what felt like an eternity, I managed to loosen them enough to slip free. I waited, watching the guard closely. When he nodded off again, I quietly slipped out of the cell. I moved slowly, staying low and using the shadows for cover. I had to find a weapon or something to defend myself with. I found a small knife near one of the tents and took it. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I made my way to the edge of the camp, careful to avoid the guards. My heart pounded in my chest as I neared the jungle. Freedom was so close, but I had to stay calm and move carefully. Just as I was about to slip into the jungle, I heard a shout. One of the guards had seen me. I bolted into the undergrowth, running as fast as I could. Behind me, I heard them giving chase. The jungle was dense, but I used it to my advantage, weaving through the trees and bushes to lose them. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. The shouts grew fainter, but I didn't stop. I couldn't risk being caught again. Eventually, I found a small stream and followed it, hoping it would lead me to safety. Dawn was breaking when I stumbled upon a small village. The locals were wary at first, but when I told them my story, they took me in and gave me food and water. They contacted the authorities, and soon our rescue team arrived. The ordeal was over, but the fear and adrenaline still coursed through me. I was safe, but the memories of those terrifying days in the jungle would stay with me forever. I had survived, but I knew I would never be the same. The jungle, which once seemed so full of adventure, now held a darker, more sinister place in my mind. I had always wanted to explore the Carpathian Mountains. The forests there were supposed to be untouched and beautiful, so I planned a solo hiking trip. I arrived in a small village at the foot of the mountains and set off early in the morning. The first day was amazing. The trees were tall and thick, the air was fresh, and the trails were peaceful. The next day, I decided to venture off the main path and explore deeper into the forest. I felt confident in my navigation skills, and I had a map and a compass. As the hours passed, I realized I had underestimated the density of the forest. The trees looked the same, and the terrain was confusing. I lost track of the trail and soon found myself in an area I didn't recognize. Panic started to set in as the daylight began to fade. I tried to backtrack, but nothing looked familiar. My map was useless in this dense forest. I kept walking, hoping to find a sign of the trail or a clearing. The forest was eerily silent, and I felt like I was being watched. After a few more hours of walking, I saw a light in the distance. Relieved, I headed towards it, thinking it might be a campsite or a cabin. As I got closer, I saw it was a group of men around a campfire. They looked like loggers, with axes and tools scattered around. I approached them, hoping they could help me find my way back. The men noticed me and stood up. Their faces were hard to read, but they didn't seem friendly. I explained I was lost and needed help. One of them, a tall man with a scar on his cheek, stepped forward. He nodded and said they could help, but there was something off about his tone. He told me to sit by the fire and offered me some food. I hesitated, but I was exhausted and hungry. As I ate, I noticed the other men whispering among themselves and glancing at me. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the warmth of the fire. After a while, the tall man told me they had a cabin nearby where I could stay for the night. He said it was too dangerous to travel through the forest in the dark. I felt uneasy but agreed, thinking it was better than staying out in the open. We walked through the forest for about an hour until we reached a small, run-down cabin. They led me inside and showed me a room where I could sleep. The door didn't have a lock, which made me even more nervous. The men left me alone, and I lay down on the cot, trying to calm my racing thoughts. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of voices outside the cabin. I crept to the window and peeked out. The men were gathered around a large hole they had dug in the ground. They were talking in hushed tones, but I could make out bits and pieces of their conversation. They mentioned something about hiding evidence and making sure no one found out. A chill ran down my spine. I realized these men were hiding something they were willing to kill to protect. I knew I had to get out of there before they decided I was a threat. I waited until the men went back into the cabin and the forest was silent again. I quietly gathered my things and slipped out of the room. The cabin creaked with every step I took, but I moved as silently as I could. I found the front door and carefully opened it, wincing at the sound of the hinges. Once outside, I ran into the forest, not caring which direction I was going, just needing to get away. The forest was pitch black, and I stumbled over roots and rocks. I didn't dare use my flashlight, afraid the men would see it. I could hear them shouting behind me, realizing I had escaped. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed through the thick undergrowth. After what felt like hours of running, I saw the faint glow of dawn. I was exhausted but couldn't stop. I needed to put as much distance between me and those men as possible. Eventually, I came across a stream and followed it, hoping it would lead me to a village or a road. By midday, I was completely drained. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and I could barely keep my eyes open. Just as I was about to collapse, I stumbled onto a dirt road. I followed it and soon saw a small cabin in the distance. I approached it cautiously, praying it was safe. An elderly couple lived there. They were shocked to see me in such a state but took me in without hesitation. I told them what had happened, and they immediately called the local authorities. The police arrived and took my statement, promising to investigate the loggers. I spent the next few days recovering at the couple's home. They were kind and caring, helping me regain my strength. I couldn't shake the fear that the loggers would come after me, but the couple assured me I was safe with them. Eventually, the police informed me they had found the logging camp but no sign of the men. They assured me they would continue searching and keep an eye out for any suspicious activity. I knew it was unlikely they would be caught, but I was grateful to be alive. The experience left me shaken. The Carpathian Mountains, once a symbol of adventure and beauty, now held a dark and terrifying memory. I had been planning my trip to Finland for months. The forests there looked beautiful in pictures, and I wanted to experience them in person. I arrived in a small village near the forest and set out early in the morning. The air was crisp, and the scenery was breathtaking. Tall trees, green moss, and the sound of birds made it feel like a fairy tale. I was walking deeper into the forest, following a trail that wasn't marked on the map but looked well used. I figured it would loop back to the main path eventually. After a couple of hours, I realized I hadn't seen any signs or other hikers for a while. I shrugged it off and kept going, enjoying the peace and quiet. Around noon, I decided to take a break. I found a nice spot near a small stream and sat down to eat my lunch. The sound of the water was calming, and I lost track of time. When I checked my watch, I figured it was time to head back. I packed up my things and started walking, but the trail looked different somehow. I must have taken a wrong turn because I ended up in a part of the forest that didn't look familiar at all. The trees were closer together, and there was no clear path. I tried retracing my steps, but nothing looked right. I started to feel a bit uneasy but kept walking, hoping to find something I recognized. After another hour of wandering, I heard a noise behind me. It was a rustling sound, like someone moving through the underbrush. I turned around, but I didn't see anything. I shook it off and kept walking, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me. Suddenly, I heard a shout. I turned to see a man emerging from the trees. He looked angry and was shouting in Finnish. I couldn't understand him, but his tone was clear. He was furious. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder and was pointing at me, gesturing wildly. I tried to explain that I was lost and didn't mean any harm, but he kept shouting. I decided to move away from him, hoping he would calm down if I showed I wasn't a threat. But as I walked faster, he started following me. I picked up the pace, and so did he. My heart was pounding, and I could hear him crashing through the forest behind me. I broke into a run, adrenaline kicking in. The forest was dense, and I had to dodge branches and jump over roots. I could hear him getting closer, shouting and swearing. I didn't know what he was saying, but it was clear he wasn't going to let me go easily. I stumbled and nearly fell, but I caught myself and kept running. The forest seemed endless, and I had no idea where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from him. I could hear his footsteps getting louder, and I pushed myself to run faster. I came to a small clearing and saw an old, abandoned cabin. I darted inside, hoping to find a place to hide. The cabin was empty, with broken furniture and debris scattered around. I found a corner behind an overturned table and crouched down, trying to catch my breath. I could hear the man outside, shouting and cursing. He must have seen me go into the cabin. I heard the door creak open, and his footsteps inside. My heart was pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. He moved around the cabin, checking each room. He was getting closer to where I was hiding. I could see his boots through a crack in the table. He paused for a moment, and I held my breath. Then he moved away, and I heard him leave the cabin. I waited, not daring to move, until I was sure he was gone. I slowly stood up and looked around. There was no sign of him, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I quietly slipped out of the cabin and started moving again, keeping to the shadows and staying as silent as possible. I needed to find my way back to the village, but I had no idea which direction to go. I walked for what felt like hours, my nerves on edge. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him coming after me. The forest was getting darker, and I knew I had to find shelter before nightfall. Just as the last light was fading, I saw a dirt road through the trees. I hurried towards it, hoping it would lead me back to civilization. As I reached the road, I heard a vehicle approaching. I ducked behind a tree, unsure if it was safe. A truck came into view, and I saw a couple inside. They looked like locals, and I decided to take the chance. I stepped out onto the road and waved them down. They stopped, and I quickly explained what had happened. They seemed concerned and offered to take me back to the village. I climbed into the truck, grateful to be away from the forest. They drove me back to the village and took me to the local police station. I told the officers everything, and they assured me they would investigate. They said the man I described was known for being territorial and had a history of aggression. I spent the night at a small inn, still shaken from the ordeal. The next day, the police told me they had found the man and were dealing with him. They advised me to stick to marked trails in the future and avoid wandering off alone. The experience left me wary of venturing into unknown areas. The beauty of the finished forest was overshadowed by the fear I felt that day.